So good afternoon, friends. Today we are continuing our year with Bayard Rustin, and we will be focusing on his international work, his international presence, in particular his anti-colonialist work. Rustin had this remarkable capacity to focus effectively on the nitty-gritty of organizing, while at the same time viewing multiple issues from multiple angles, kind of from multiple levels, all simultaneously. And one of the levels that I think was present in everything he did was the recognition that his work in the United States was connected to and part of a truly global international struggle for freedom, for self-determination, for peace, for the kind of specific issues about which he was so passionate. In 1948, Rustin traveled to India to speak to the leaders of the and participants in the Gandhian movement for Indian independence. Gandhi himself had been assassinated a few months before Rustin got there. But Rustin ended up both traveling pretty broadly within India and speaking to a whole lot of people. Now, Rustin had been a pacifist for a very long time at this point. Remember that he spent 2 years in prison for draft resistance. But what Rustin really got out of his visit to India was being exposed to, and then for himself further developing, kind of the idea of revolutionary nonviolence. So nonviolence as the energy that was powering, in the case of India, that was powering the overthrow of a centuries-long system of colonial domination. And so this brought nonviolence as a unifying principle to the fore of Rustin's work, where it stayed ever after. A few years later, in 1952, the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the AFSC sent Rustin to West Africa to build contacts between US pacifists and African independence leaders. So Rustin spent time in what was then called the Gold Coast and is now called Ghana, as well as Nigeria. He wrote back in one of his letters that he's talking about Accra, so Ghana, that in this dirty, poor, ambitious city, I find much that I find in Harlem. We left here in 1619, yet the people sing, walk, laugh, cry, dance, and strive in a way that is like 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. I seem to know and to understand them as I do nowhere else but in Harlem. Rustin wanted to stay in West Africa to continue building ties between nonviolent movements across the world, including the United States. But the Fellowship of Reconciliation called him back. So he returned to the United States. Rustin started kind of a serious effort to reorient the Fellowship of Reconciliation towards a substantive engagement with the liberation movements in Africa. He actually got the FOR board with a narrowish majority to support this reorientation. Rustin himself was on a 4-month speaking tour regarding his trip to Africa when he was arrested in Pasadena for having sex with men in a car, which kind of derailed this whole thing for quite a while. What Rustin had witnessed in West Africa, really confirmed that Gandhian nonviolence could be the defining feature of racial liberation across 3 continents. He does not support armed struggle as an anti-colonialist tactic. So it's kind of interesting looking at some of his writings from the time that a lot of the organizations that became prominent subsequently, like the African National Congress, the ANC, are not ones that he talks about. Rustin also is very careful to distinguish between anti-colonialism in an African and South Asian context and civil rights in the United States. The struggle is to liberate people from what we would now call white supremacy. But Rustin pretty consistently talks about kind of the concrete differences between a Black majority population throwing off, white colonial rule, rule by a white European minority, and a Black minority in the United States achieving equality in a majority white country. Again, he sees the fuel of these movements as being comparable. He sees the enemy as being comparable, but he sees the kind of objective conditions and the opportunities for organizing to change as being radically different. And this is one of Rustin's disagreements with the Black nationalist movement in the United States, which I think we will probably cover a little more in some other session. And just because I have to say this because it tickled me so much, the most biting criticism of Malcolm X that I have ever read came from Bayard Rustin, who felt that the Nation of Islam's economic program was petty bourgeois. In any case, towards the end of his life, in the late 70s and 80s, Rustin again traveled extensively for Freedom House. He served as an election monitor in Zimbabwe and South Africa, among other countries, and he became a passionate advocate for refugees from across the world, with kind of specific emphasis on Uganda, Ethiopia, El Salvador, and Southeast Asia. So kind of this internationalist perspective on national struggles was something central to who Rustin was, and principled faith-based nonviolence was the glue that, for him, held it all together. Which I think is fascinating, in terms of learning about Bayard Rustin. But as so many themes that we're going to explore over the course of the year, they didn't end in the early 60s or late 50s or kind of the last time that Bayard Rustin approached them, that a lot of these issues are very present in December of 2021. And so to bring some of this into the present, we are blessed today to have a panel of Adelphi members who are going to speak a little about their work raising the voices of formerly colonized people. And Chloe, if you don't mind going first.
Thank you all. Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. I'll start by saying I'm an old Africa hand. That's a loaded label. It's loaded because I got to Africa on June 4th of 1979, and I was there a total of 15 years, 10 years in Kenya, 3 years in South Africa, 2 years in Uganda, but I traveled and worked in 22 different countries in Africa. So I saw a lot of Africa. I saw some things that were very disturbing, some things that were very heartwarming about our common humanity. But I want to start with my very first trip to Dar es Salaam, what was then the capital of Tanzania. And I remember leaving a friend's house, a white person, and we were got on this road and we were following this car that was a very beaten up old car, nothing particularly wonderful about it. But there were 4 motorcyclists, 2 in front and 2 in back in uniforms with this car. And the person I was with was another old Africa hand, but a genuine one. This man had been there for years. And he said, "Do you know who that is?" I said, "Absolutely no idea." And he said, "That's the president of the country. That's Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania." And it was so stunning that he was there in a clapped out old car with just 4 motorcycle riders. And I said, "Well, that's not very ostentatious." And the guy turned to me and said, "Bingo." He was the exception, and he had many faults and problems. I'm not going to rave about Nyerere here, but he was the exception in the sense that he looked at what this whole period of European colonization of Africa had been, and instead of emulating it, said, no, we're going to do something really quite different here. Well, I'm sad to report that that is not the norm. And throughout my time in Africa, what I found was that although there's a very disagreeable history of colonization, which used to be kind of a romantic term in the United States, those nice little British colonials, or nice colonial furniture. There's nothing wonderful or romantic about colonization in Africa. It was exploitative, it was arrogant, it was condescending, it was all about power and money. It was very patriarchal in its norms. It was very, very hard on local people. So you would think with the independence movement that swept through Africa that they would have thrown that aside as hard as they could. No, they emulated it. And so much of the current problems of Africa, where I still continue to do a lot of work, is generated not only by an international system that still exploits the weaker countries of the world and gives the strongest countries the most favorable conditions of trade, but by emulating this way of being the dominant caste. African elites are terrible to the poor people in their countries. They are emulating the worst of the former colonial powers. It's not a model that we want to see, but it's how deep the damage goes. It's actually a spiritual scar on the continent. Trying to rise above that is the work that Africa is going to have to do now. But that legacy is something that we carry forward. And we carry forward it in a way that I feel very poignantly needs an answer. And the answer needs to be a whole different relationship between us and them. A relationship that is one of fellowship, of camaraderie, of being united in solidarity. And I'm going to end with an image, 2 images actually, that are really strong in my mind about this. One of which is walking through the streets of Pretoria just after Nelson Mandela came to power, and being there with a man named Thulani Mthembu, who was a man who worked for me. I ran a regional planning office in Durban. We were up in Pretoria, and he had this huge smile on his face as we were just walking down a sidewalk. And I said, "Thulani, what's the big smile?" Thulani was not prone to smiles. He says, "I'm walking on the sidewalk next to a white person." I said, "And so?" And he said, "Until just a year or so ago, this was forbidden." here in South Africa, a country predominantly of Black people, we were not allowed to walk on a sidewalk if a white person was there. And he looked at me, he said, "This is my sidewalk." And then he said, "No, this is our sidewalk." And that generosity of spirit was just so moving. The other image that I will never forget till my dying day is visiting my son. Christine and I and Audrey visited Ian when he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Benin, in West Africa, in a tiny little village, miles and miles and miles from any paved road. So it was a really tough journey getting there. Ian, in this little village, was there as a teacher, teaching in a school that had no floors. It just had dirt floors. It had no walls. It was just very humble roof, corrugated metal, teaching a class with 80 kids in it. I don't know what you can possibly hope to achieve with 80 children in a class. But the way that he lived in this very, very modest house with no power, no water, it was 110 degrees inside. I mean, it was really hard living, but that's the way people lived. And there he was, shoulder to shoulder, working with them, really connected with them, and they really connected with him. And I said, yes, this is the pattern. This is what we can do to help people really acknowledge who they are, see that of God in them, speak to that God within them by our example, by standing in that solidarity and living the hard life with them. Ian is now in Dakar, Senegal, continuing to work as an international development practitioner, not living quite as modestly, but this is one way forward to really respond to people everywhere as human beings, as we ought to as Quakers, as we ought to as human beings. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Mary.
Well, thank you so much, Chloe, for giving the overarching ideas and important images of sort of what colonial legacy is. My experience is a little different because I spent the first 20 years from 79 of my professional life in Nicaragua, where the colonial history is a lot farther away. Nicaragua became independent from Spain in 1834. What they have very present is a very, very invasive, aggressive policy of imperialism. And when I was in Nicaragua, the United States was actively trying to overthrow the government, preparing to invade. And so being an American wasn't in any way sort of an advantage in terms of relationships or power. And I think during that period, I learned to take a back seat and, learn perhaps a little bit of humility of being an American. Came back to the United States about 20, little bit more years ago and started working more in research. And I think most of you know that I work on research on violence against women primarily and around the world now. So including a lot of colonial, post-colonial settings in Africa and South Asia, and really saw, a very big difference in the way that, and evidenced in the way development works in general, where to a very large extent, donors and former colonial powers still wield an enormous amount of power over everything and around national policy and in development aid. At least half, if not more, of the money that goes into it, supposedly to make the lives of Africans and Asians better, actually stays in the United States, either through procurement practices or because almost all of the aid is managed by, in the US case, by US companies and US consultants. So I think it's a very, the question of who development aid is for and who it benefits the most is a lot more complicated than we would think. So coming into the research, what I wanted to talk a little bit about how we, particularly most recently, have been thinking about how to decolonize our research practices. And this is something that in my institute, the Global Women's Institute at George Washington, we've been thinking a lot about, particularly with the window of the crisis of COVID, and then George Floyd shaking us out of our complacency and making us really think about how do we step up to this moment, and the language of decolonizing research has become very important to us. So the question is sort of how do you do that? And I think in my field where we research violence against women, and many of us both in the global North and South have experienced violence, there's sort of an equalizing function there that as researchers, it makes it easier for us to look at our common humanity with those that we're doing research with, because many of us have experienced the same, although not in the same conditions. But I think there are two words that are terms that are helping us think about it, how to be more intentionally anti-colonial. And one of them is intersectionality, and understanding that women and girls everywhere experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, so that we are trying to stay away from looking at averages, what is the national average of domestic violence, for example, and aggregates, but really drilling down into the specific experiences of the most marginalized women. And often those are invisible, and make sure that we're giving them a voice. So looking into the specific experiences of ethnic minorities, women with disabilities, in gender nonconforming individuals, women and girls living in conflict settings. Those are all the areas that we're trying to prioritize now. And it means that we have to ask new questions. We have to use new methods to actually find those people. Random household samples does not give you usually a good window onto groups that are often invisible. And even like who does the research and the safety involved in delving into these questions. Another piece around that is trying to look, instead of cases of violence, which is the most dehumanizing way of looking at it, sort of percentage of violence, we're trying to look at and make sure that we're looking at individuals and centering individuals. So we're not sort of dividing violence into here's domestic violence, here's child sexual abuse, here's honor violence, here's child marriage, and that's how, here's rape during war. This is how we often as researchers will take a little slice, a piece of violence, and we'll look at that. Well, when you start centering individuals, many women experience all of those forms of violence. And so we're trying to not put people into neat categories, but really look at all the messiness and complexity and sort of accumulated trauma that people experience because of all these forms of discrimination as well as violence. So that's one word. And the other one is equity, which really talks about power and who has the power, both in partnerships and access to information, whose voice matters. And that really requires rethinking how research is done, typically in the North. Often the purpose of research is actually to further individual careers and institutions, to raise prestige, to raise more money. The metric for determining a good researcher, a credible researcher, is by peer-reviewed publications. It's not by political changes or policies that come out as a result. It's not by the usefulness to the communities that are being studied. So looking at, so this comes down to the issues of sort of who decides what questions are important, what kind of knowledge is valued. Is it only randomized controlled trials, which by donors and in the global North is the standard for what good non-biased knowledge is? And now we're beginning to really value a lot more practice-based knowledge, the knowledge of not just individuals, but communities, and what they've learned through working. For example, we're doing a lot of evaluation of prevention programs. And so not just using clinical trials, but really doing a lot more talking to communities. So it also, a lot of it is changing the power dynamics among researchers, and historically in most public health research, certainly, and in our own field of violence against women, it's mostly dominated by a very small group of white Northern women. We're the ones who had the most access to funding, conference opportunities, travel, and et cetera. And so it's not, you know, at first I like to think that, well, we're just the ones who really wanted to do this work and who saw the need and started devoting ourselves to it. But also recognizing that it's really not an accident that, you know, there's 10 white women who are the leaders in my particular small field. And so how do we turn that around and change the power dynamics of how we do research? So I think I have still another minute or two, and I'll give a couple examples of what it means to us concretely. So we're doing right now, we're leading a consortium of over 100 researchers to try and get some funding from the UK government in researching violence. And we have been putting a lot of care into looking at equity and power between North and South. And among our partnership, we originally started with, you know, 3 organizations that I work very closely with, which are all Northern-based universities. I'm thinking, okay, that's not going to work. How do we change this around? And we spent a lot of time looking at Southern-based institutions and researchers that, you know, we knew or we met, and just spent a lot of time figuring out how do we make sure that they have equal power. So we have 6 core organizations, 3 of whom are from the Global South, and we have a whole set of metrics for absolutely you know, the big international organizations all want to partner with us, but we've explicitly deprioritized them and prioritized Southern institutions and Southern researchers. Now 70% of the institutions in our global partnership and of the researchers are from the Global South. And I don't think that would have happened naturally. That was something that we had to do sort of intentionally. Also, the kinds of research we did used to do a lot of quantitative studies and, you know, some RCT, randomized control trials. We're now trying to do a lot more participatory research, which, as I said, is not as valued by the sort of general powers that be, but we think that it's bringing much more useful concrete results. So, for example, a project on sexual violence among refugees in Lebanon and Uganda, instead of just going and doing a survey of women, we did a participatory approach where we trained women refugees to be researchers and to observe, you know, distribution of wood and firewood and water and food in their communities, and look for ways and sort of shine a light on different ways that women were being exploited and put at risk through these processes. And through all of this, the women developed new ways of distributing aid that would be less harmful for them. And our role is really bridging, in a way, using our voice to make sure that the UK government and World Vision and CARE and others are really looking to this as a model for how to reduce sexual exploitation. And then the last example I'll give is, for example, doing research on social movements. And so we've created a partnership of women's rights, feminist researchers in India, South Africa, Nicaragua, and among Indigenous women in Australia, and with a particular emphasis on youth researchers. And so a lot of them are people who don't have much research experience, but they've got a huge amount of practice-based experience from being leaders in the feminist movement. And we're developing a methodology that really lifts up the history of not just the feminist movement globally, nationally in each country, but in India, they're looking specifically at women's movement among Dalit women, among Muslim women, among particularly marginalized groups of women, and altogether sort of with those threads, weaving a history that is much richer than sort of what's usually seen as kind of the official history. And the purpose of it is, in the midst of all this interest in violence against women globally and by the UN, there's a very political content to this, which is none of this would have happened if the feminist movement hadn't brought this around and local women hadn't demanded it. And so we're documenting all of that to sort of say, okay, finally, if you're putting money into this, we want to make sure that the money continues to flow back towards these groups that have done all the work all along, that it just doesn't go to the NGO, international NGOs and the governments. And so this is kind of our contribution of putting more voices and more power in the voices of Southern activists. So I'll end there, but just saying that this is, it's, you know, sometimes kind of painful because it comes back to, you know, even myself, things that I sort of thought that I could take pride in, my own, you know, my own experiences, my own choices, things I've done, and then coming to terms with, you know, that's, it's not all me because I'm a great person. It's also coming to terms with and acknowledging my own privilege and power in this. And then figuring out metrics and accountability. So not, how do we just not say that we want to have more equity and have an intersectional approach, but how do we make sure that we are actually doing it, and how do we create measures to sort of hold ourselves accountable? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary. Jolie.
An expert on international work at all. And when I first accepted being on this panel, I thought, oh, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about my work with work camps in the US, which certainly has a colonial aspect to it, because the people we were working with were always marginalized, either Native Americans or African Americans or poor Kentuckians or something like that. And I still think that in a way that's relevant to anti-colonialism, because usually the work campers came in as experts, thinking they were experts. But the AFSC, with whom I was working at the time, was very scrupulous about making sure that whatever we did in a community in the US was based on what the community said they wanted, so that we were never going to go and do something that the community hadn't asked for. And I think that was a very important part of what the FSC work camps were like. For instance, when I was working on a Cherokee Indian reservation in North Carolina, they had asked for clean water, latrines, and a few other very specific things that they wanted to have happen. And we were led by a Native American, a Cherokee, who supervised our work. And so I think that this is a relevant thing to the idea of anti-colonialism. Quaker missionaries were very, very active, especially in Africa and in other places. And at first I wasn't really clear about, well, when I was in seminary as a Methodist, I had intended to become a missionary. And I was very active in the mission group. And then I found out what missionaries had often done, that they had gone into communities, told the people that their customs were wrong. They couldn't have more than one wife or more than one husband, the things they had to do in order to become a Christian. And at that time, as a 20-something-year-old, I said, no, that's wrong. This is their customs, this is their way of life. And we should not tell them that other things have to happen before they can become a Christian. And so I abandoned the idea of becoming a missionary at that time. And I didn't know until we had our Kenyan resident at Adelphi whether that happened with Quaker missionaries. And he said that his father was unable to become a Quaker, as he was a Quaker, because he had more than one wife. And I thought, oh, this is just like all the other Christians, not just, not just us. And so I realized that had happened with Quakers also. I don't know whether it's happened in other parts of the world. I'm just not clear about that. I've only been to two, I've been very active with the BYM Intervisitation Program group. And I have only been to two other countries, Kenya and Cuba. And in Cuba, it was very interesting to me that the missionaries were held in great, they were laudatory individuals. They first came to Cuba to Hibara from Iowa Yearly Meeting, and they have a celebration every year of the date that happened. And I was very lucky to be there in 2000 when it was the 100th anniversary. And we went down to the waterfront as if we were meeting the ship that came from Jamaica with the Iowa Yearly Meeting missionaries. And Wilmington Yearly Meeting was also very active and established a school, which is now called El Colegio Wilmington, because colegio refers to a high school in Spanish. And they had a picture in one of the churches of Juan Woolman, very big picture. So that has been a very important thing. But in terms of intervisitation, I have visited a lot of meetings, many in person and some not in person on Zoom. And I must say that I think the Friends United meeting is making a very real effort to decolonize Quakerism. That they no longer feel that, excuse me, white Quakers are supposed to go and evangelize around the world. And the big examples of this are that Oscar Umbali, who has visited both BYM and Adelphi, a Kenyan pastor, is now working in Belize for FUM. And a couple, the Otemios, have been working in Tanzania and established almost overnight 800 churches in Tanzania. So they're reaching out. And even Indiana Yearly Meeting, which I consider to be one of the more conservative yearly meetings in FUM, sent a group of men to Kenya, and where they had a mission, something about growing corn or seeds or something like that. And they came back with a report that it should be turned over to the Kenyans. It was no longer a mission program. It was a Kenyan program. And they've also got a missionary in Uganda from Kenya. So I think that the prospects are good for decolonizing, excuse me, Quakerism, which is what I was asked to do. And by the way, I have news, and I don't know how many of you have heard this, that Oscar Mbali is getting married, and he's marrying a Swedish woman who used to be a missionary. I have no idea whether she's a Quaker or not, but that's the big news this summer.
Thank you, Julie.
There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded